It's the DIY audio guy, and it's part 2 of the 3-way front stage build. So let's pop off the negative battery terminal and start stripping out some old gear. Out with the old, in with the new. In this video, we're going to be taking out the amplifier rack and building a new amplifier rack to hold our new amplifiers. That's going to require pulling out the subwoofer enclosure first. This is a prefab enclosure that I've had for probably about 6 years now. It's beginning to show a little bit of wear, but it seems to be playing music just fine. So let's go ahead and slide this big old guy out and let's check out the amplifier rack. This is what it looks like in the area underneath the back seat and behind the subwoofer enclosure. The RCA wires are going to stay in the truck, so I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect those real quick. Let's dig out the old trusty Allen wrench set and start removing the amplifiers. This is the 4-channel Rockford Fosgate that powers the coaxial speakers in the doors. It works great, but I need something with a smaller footprint so I can fit more amplifiers back here. I've got it connected to the factory wire via a run of Stinger speed wire. The wire is staying in, so I need to unhook the speaker terminals. I'm going to go ahead and remove the power and ground while I'm at it. I want to point out here that I did use wire ferrules, which just makes the install neat and clean. Now let's move on to the Alpine monoblock that powered the subs. You can see from the shot that it's very difficult to get into this really tight space. Looking back, I realized that all of these wires were coming out, so I could have just left them on until I pulled the amp rack out of the vehicle. So that wasted a lot of time and energy and effort. I decided to leave the footage in the video though, so that perhaps you might learn from my mistake and maybe you'll be more efficient when you pull gear out of your vehicle. So this is a combination power and ground distribution block with fuses. I have to remove this from the vehicle and I've got to leave the 0 gauge wire in. So what happens is 0 gauge wire comes in and then we go out to the right and the left with a fuse out to some 4 gauge wire. So that's got to come undone here in the vehicle. I can't do that on the bench. And I hate this fuse block because it's so hard to get a tool on the fuse block. You can see me here struggling with that. And the 2 4 gauge wires on the outsides have to come off first because it's impossible to get any kind of tool into that center one with the side bushings in place. I just find this fuse block extremely hard to use and would not recommend it. I'm using the seatbelt mechanism to hold the amplifier rack down, so I've got to pull these 2 seatbelt connectors out. You find all kind of cool things when you start working underneath the seats of a car. There's a nice ugly stink bug there that died at some point. Now with everything unhooked, the amp rack just slides right out and we take it over to the workbench. It's so much easier to work on these kind of things on a bench instead of in the car. Now I'm going to unscrew everything from the amp rack. I'm not sure why I grabbed a screwdriver here instead of a power drill. I guess I was just in the mood to make things difficult that day. The amp rack is going to be tossed. It's PVC and it's not rigid enough. I'm switching to ABS. It'll be thinner and it'll be a lot more rigid and make for a better amp rack. I'm going through all this trouble because I need to add 4 more channels of amplification, but I don't have any room in my existing setup to just stick another amp in there. I need to rearrange things and switch to amplifiers with a smaller footprint. Here we have the 2 Kenwood amplifiers, which are 400 watts total between the 2 of them going into a 4 ohm loads, sitting on top of the Rockford Fosgate amplifier, which is 300 watts going into a 4 ohm load. We can also compare those 2 Kenwoods to the Alpine monoblock, which is 500 watts at 2 ohms as well, and we can see that the Kenwoods together, 2 of them, are a lot smaller than the single Alpine monoblock. Finally, we're going to put the 2 Kenwoods side by side with the Rockford Fosgate and see just how much taller the Rockford Fosgate is relative to the Kenwoods. It's not a very big difference. This gives me some extra clearance around the amps for better cooling. For the subs, I'm going to be using an NVX 4-channel amplifier. If you don't know about NVX, it's the house brand for Sonic Electronics. Here are some shots comparing it to the Alpine monoblock. It's similar in length to the Alpine monoblock, but it's not as wide as the Alpine monoblock. Now this particular amp has gotten a lot of praise because it's based on what's known as the Philips board. There are a lot of other manufacturers that have used the Philips board. PPI has used it, Soundstream has used it, Polk Audio has used it, and so it's a well-known, reliable board. But to my knowledge, this NVX is the last brand that's carrying this Philips board. I can't find it anywhere outside of this NVX amplifier. And it was on sale, so I grabbed it thinking I could use it for my front stage build when I finally got around to doing it. I was attracted to its small footprint and its fantastic power output, but it's really way too much power for what I'm trying to do, and it's actually too big for what I need. I lifted up the back seat when I got it in and did a little test fit, only to find out that it just wasn't going to work with the space that I had available. So since I've got it laying around and it's a fantastic, powerful amplifier, I'm going to hook it up to the subs. Now that the amp rack teardown and disassembly is complete, it's time to actually start building the amp rack. What I've got here is some 1/4 inch thick ABS. I've got a 2 foot by 2 foot sheet, and I'm going to rip this thing down into two 2 foot by 9.5 inch pieces. So I've got my saw set for 9.5 inches. I really should have the blade guard here, but the reality is that the blade guard doesn't do terribly much as long as you don't put your hand in the blade. You'll be just fine without the blade guard in place. I do have my riving knife in place. The riving knife is a must-have when making cuts on the table saw. So we're going to run this stuff through the saw. We're going to run it through twice, and that's going to leave us a little bit of a small hanging edge piece, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with that here in just a second. So here's an important safety tip for you. I'm making a crosscut on the saw using the miter gauge. In order to make a crosscut on the saw with the miter gauge, you can't let your piece rub up against the fence. That's going to cause the piece to bind and you're going to get a kickback. So what I've done here is I've taken a 1-inch block, it's just 2 pieces of 1/2 inch MDF that I glued together, and I've placed that up against the fence. And then I set the fence for 1 inch more than I need. So what I'm going to do is make a 9.5 inch long piece here, and so I set the fence at 10.5 inches. I pull that 1-inch block out after I've got my cut all set up, and I go through and make the cut using the miter gauge. This is the proper and safe way to do a cross cut on a table saw. Make sure you do it like this so you don't have your piece come back, hit you in the face, or drag your fingers across that blade. So now I'm going to start laying out the amp rack. This actually took a lot of time, and I've cut most of it out of the video. What I've got are 3 pieces of ABS that I'm going to be connecting together. And I've taken the old amp rack and marked out the areas that I need to trim for the seat belt. I wound up placing the Kenwood amplifiers lengthwise instead of side by side across the length of the amp rack. I did this because the fuse is on one end and the gain is on the other, so I had to choose between blocking the gains and blocking the fuses, or turn them 90 degrees so I had access to both of them. I reserve the right to go back and change that later. It's my gear, I can do what I want with it. Now I'm going to experiment a little bit and try to figure out the best way to fit all the gear. Here is the DIY question of the episode. Do you have a box of random screws laying around? I keep mine in an old tackle box. Where do you keep all yours? So I'm using these random screws to connect my 3 pieces of plastic, so I have one piece that is about 54 inches long. I cut some thin strips on the table saw earlier. You can rewind and see that. It's in this video. I attached all this with super glue and some accelerator, and the screws are there for reinforcement. Now I'm ready to start mounting parts to the amp rack. I'm going to start with the Kenwoods. I marked the holes with a silver Sharpie. These things are great for marking on dark plastic. I'm going to leave an affiliate link in the comments so you can support the DIY audio guy by buying something that you are probably going to buy anyway. These amps came with screws and zip ties. I decided to use the zip ties since the screws were a bit long and stuck out through the other side of the plastic, and they're sharp and pointy, and that's not a lot of fun. For fuses, I'm going to use a pair of 80 amp fuses. The NVX amplifier has 75 amps worth of onboard fusing, so 80 amps matches up pretty nice with that. The 2 Kenwood amplifiers are 30 amps each, so I'm going to go for an 80 amp fuse for those. I'm also going to take that line and I'm going to split it into another fuse block where I'm going to be running the fuse for the DSP, so I figured 80 amps is the closest thing that I have to that. So I have 2 runs of 4 gauge coming out of a new Concepts fuse block. I used wire ferrules and heat shrink, and the wires covered in blue Tech Flex. One of the wires is going to go down to the subwoofer amp on the other side of the truck. The other is going to loop back around to a second fuse block. That block will then split the power into the Kenwoods and the DSP. The fuse block is good for 100 amps total with a max of 30 amps per circuit. It's just a generic block from Amazon. I'll give you some links in the description below so you can check these things out. Here you can see that connection. I'm just using a simple spade terminal here. These are 4-gauge spade terminals going onto some 4-gauge wire. Now I'm going to connect a ground wire here to the ground portion of that fuse block. So I'm taking my 8-gauge wire and just kind of laying it out, getting a rough measurement of where I think I'm going to need to cut it. And I've got an old pair of cutters that I've had forever. These things got rusty in an old toolbox. And as you can see here, they're just not getting the job done. They can't quite cut through that 8-gauge wire. And this is one of those things that's important. You really got to have the tools to do the job. So here are some great big cutters that I got from Parts Express, and they just snip right through any wire with no problem. So this is a lug crimper that I got off of Amazon. I'm using it to crimp the lugs on my 4 and 8-gauge connections, and I absolutely positively despise this thing. It takes 4 hands to use it. The dies fall out. It leaks oil. I can't possibly recommend this. Now the thing is, it's just some random one that I bought off of Amazon, and so I'm not sure which one to tell you not to buy. But this thing was a piece of junk, so I cheaped out on it and bought one of the cheaper ones available. I've probably had this thing for 4 years at this point, and I despise it and am looking for a better way to crimp my lugs. Let's turn our attention to the DSP. It comes with some L brackets and 8 screws. 4 of them hold the brackets to the DSP. The other 4 mount the DSP to the amp rack. Let's turn our attention to the wire harness on the digital signal processor. This harness is used for power, ground, and remote turn on. It also has 8 wires for speaker level inputs. Now those wires are color coded using the standard card audio colors. That makes it really handy for factory integration. You can run some speed wire from a factory head unit and then just match up the colors. I'm just going to cut those and tape them off. No need for those in this particular install. Now there's a yellow power wire, and it's got a 3 amp fuse mounted into an inline fuse holder. There's also a black ground wire. There's a red wire that turns the unit on like the ignition in a car if you're thinking about the color coding setup. And then there's a blue wire that is the remote turn on for our amplifiers. According to the manual, the output of that blue wire is more than half an amp. And I asked online and was told that it had plenty of power to turn on multiple amplifiers, so I'm not going to need any kind of a relay or anything to turn my amplifiers on. At least I hope not. Since I'm going to be using a fuse in my fuse block, I don't need that inline fuse, so I'm just going to cut that sucker loose, and then I'm going to extend the yellow wire. I'm also going to lengthen the black wire and the blue wire, and I'm going to put a crimp terminal on the remote turn on input. I get these crimp terminals down the street at the parts store. It was getting late in the day, so I set the cameras aside and started zip tying everything down so I could get a test fit of the amplifier. Installing this stuff is difficult. Filming is difficult. Doing both at the same time is a real adventure. So I didn't get any footage of the subwoofer amplifier, but you can see it there on the end, and the amp rack fits just fine. I still need to hook everything up. I've got to solder in the speaker wire connections, hook the power and ground up. I've got to set the gains. I've got to tune the system. I still have to install the speakers in the front stage. It's a ton of work. There's a whole lot left to do. There's going to be more videos coming out, so make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss out on the adventure. I am the DIY Audio Guy, and I am signing out.